and welcome to the new episode of Two Old Psychologists Talking About Stuff. We've got a new guest tonight, Dr. Freddy Jackson-Brown, but before we get to him, I want to catch up with Ray. So, hi Ray.
Hey Rich.
What's been going on with you then, my friend? What have you been noticing?
I was at a jazz concert the other night, continuing my tour of cultural expressions. We've talked about opera in the past and you've hated it. And so I was thinking I was at this jazz concert, and one of the things I noticed is one of the kind of rules at a jazz concert, which is when musicians are taking turns and each of them maybe in turns has a solo. It's like the done thing for the audience to sort of applaud just that solo bit as it comes to an end, even though that sort of applause is over the next bit of music. And I was sitting there thinking, like, God, what a contrast. If you go on to some very serious classical thing, they wouldn't really thank you for like applauding one particularly good bit of flute playing and blotting out the whole of the next passage of music. And if you go a step further, if you go to like a rugby match or a football match, you're positively expected to shout encouragement or abuse in different measures at the participants. And I was just kind of imagining what it'd be like if you transpose the rules and people started acting by the rules of the football touchline in the middle of a classical concert or classical concert in the middle of a jazz concert. That makes it sound like I wasn't completely involved in the music. But you know what it's like when you're listening to stuff, your mind spirals off a bit.
You were away thinking about contextualism and the contextual factors around different rules and different situations. I've observed this phenomenon. Now, I kind of detest jazz. It's just not a thing that I've ever been into. It doesn't really, I don't know, it doesn't grab me at all, doesn't have any meaning for me. I actively dislike it. Which probably says more about me than anything else.
Richie hates jazz.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I think there's a little reference for all you 1980s children. I probably hate it more than opera. Probably.
Ooh.
But I've observed this phenomenon. I remember I wandered into a cafe once just to get a drink, and there was a jazz performance, and I noticed people applauding enthusiastically right in the middle of songs, and I did wonder what was going on. It did seem really odd.
Well, I mean, and again, to be all contextual about it, what's that quote? It's something like, and those that were dancing were thought mad by those who couldn't hear the tune. So if we don't notice the context, then behaviour does seem completely indecipherable.
And they say psychologists never take a day off. You've spectacularly given the lie to that.
And what about you? What have you been noticing?
Well, I noticed that the Association for Contextual Behavioural Science, which is the kind of global mothership of all things ACT, relational frame theory, etc., recently announced its awards for this year's crop of fellows. So this is a recognition given to people who've made a significant contribution to acceptance and commitment therapy, contextual behavioural science, and a certain Dr. Ray Owen of this parish was on the list. So I wanted just to publicly congratulate you for that recognition. And it's nice that all the work that you've done over the years for this community has been noticed by the sort of people that should notice these things. So well done.
Oh, well, thank you. I am touched, as I was when I first heard about the possibility of the fellowship. I mean, the obvious thing to say is in distinguished company, and I definitely am this year. There's many other distinguished, not many other, 5 other distinguished recipients, including friend of the show and recent guest of ours, Dr. Dawn Johnson. So I am in esteemed company.
Well done, mate. You very much deserve it. I think your contribution over the years is it's been significant, both in terms of the writing that you've done, the training that you've done, and obviously the therapy and the input you provided to various services. So, I'm pretty pleased to see that that's been acknowledged. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
So we have a guest for tonight, who is Dr. Freddy Jackson-Brown, and the reason we got him on was to talk to him about his work in artificial intelligence and the applications of that to contextual behavioural science. So hi, Freddy. It would be really great if you could introduce yourself just so our listeners know who you are and what you're about.
Yeah, hi Rich. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I've been working in the health service for nearly 30 years. I work in child disability and development. Yeah, that's been the place that I've spent the last 30 years working. I guess alongside that, I've also had a sort of work I've done in some universities over the years, and more recently some of the AI research I've been doing that I guess we're going to talk about later.
So it's a kind of a mixture of clinical practice and research?
Yes, I think so. I'm primarily a clinician and a practitioner. I do little bits of research, but I don't really think of myself as a researcher. I more kind of work alongside researchers who really know what they're doing. I kind of found over the years that I'm not actually very good at research. When I've collected data, it always never seems to be that great. But when I can work with people who are good at collecting data, I usually kind of find fruitful partnerships that way.
Well, Freddie, we've known each other for quite a few years now, but I realise I don't have any idea how you came to get involved in ACT in the first place. Would you be able to share that with us?
Yeah, kind of quite roundabout, I suppose, in that I went to university originally aiming to study AI. This is back in the 80s. And the university course, it was the first time they were running it. It was a kind of combination of psychology and computer science. It was called cognitive science. And there were two of us on the course together. And really, it was basically a bit of psychology and a bit of computer science kind of bolted together rather than a real fusion of the two. So I sort of went to university to try and, I guess, study a little bit of AI. I'd read lots of science fiction in the 1980s in my teenage years, and I kind of enjoyed that. And I thought, well, how do I turn that into a career? But then when I got to university, I realized that a lot of the computer science wasn't really ready for the sorts of interesting stuff that I was kind of keen to do with it. A lot of it was hard proofs of mathematical hardware that I found it not that interesting. But at university, I had a couple of great teachers, Derek Blackman, who is the professor at university, and Mecca Chiesa, and they kind of switched me on to behavioral science and looking at things contextually, looking at the world contextually and trying to build models that are kind of functional and useful in that space. So then I kind of came out of university with kind of interest in that, and I didn't quite know what to do until I met a friend in the summer who suggested that I maybe think about clinical psychology. I didn't know what it was at the time, but he said, "Why don't you try clinical psychology?" So I went down that route, then went off to do my doctorate at Southampton University. The professor there was Bob Remington, and he suggested for my dissertation that I do some work into sort of language rehab and some new ideas that were coming out in the 90s about how we could understand language through the kind of behavioral science lens. Yeah, building on Skinner's early work, but really kind of seeing what was next, really, because that was a good foundation, but it wasn't the whole story. And from there, that kind of work on language led me to kind of the work of Steve Hayes and some of the work he was doing with ACT. Back in 99, I think the first book came out. And then I did my first training with Steve up in Manchester, I think in 2001. And then ever since then, I guess I've been applying kind of the ACT model and trying to help adapt it for people and for children with developing language or with language skills that maybe aren't fully developed in the same way that for a typically developing adult would be. Yeah, well, that's a bit of a round the houses outline of how I got to be using ACT. And what's fascinating about having kind of been there sort of at the beginning of ACT, I think, is that it's quite different now to what it was when it first started out, which I really like. It hasn't kind of ossified into this is what ACT is. A lot of the basics were there, but actually all the kind of creative innovation and ideas which have kind of gone into it since then have made it a really different kind of space to be in now. And I think that's partly why it's an exciting field. It's not static at all. It's really shifted models are different, language is different, and a lot of the way it's framed is different. We've got the EAM, which has come in, extended evolutionary meta model, which is a bit confusing when you first hear, but just helps kind of make sense of all the different levels that people are having experiences. Yeah, it's been a really exciting ride. It's been quite lucky, I suppose, to be there right at the very beginning, purely by chance, really, that someone said, "Oh, well, why don't you do a bit of research in this area?" And it kind of led on to a sort of an interest in language and an interest in acceptance and commitment therapy.
So one of the questions I'm really interested in, Freddie, is how did you come to start combining an interest in ACT or contextual behavioural science more broadly with the field of artificial intelligence?
Well, I think as I just mentioned, I guess I was always interested in the AI side of things, and underneath ACT is relational frame theory. and relational frame theory is kind of model of how we're able to relate different stimuli together in generalized ways. And that forms the basis of our kind of symbolic abstract language at a higher level. So I guess it was really looking at RFT and relational frame theory that underneath ACT, and made me think, I wonder if we can model some of these basic processes in an AI system. That was where we started off. And AI has been able to, or computers, we've been able to model basic learning in a computer for many, many years. That goes back almost to the 1950s and 60s when they first started developing basic computers. But what no one had ever done before was model relational responding in an AI system. And relational responding sits at the heart of human language, according to RFT anyway. And we wondered, well, could we model that basic relational responding in an AI system and then use that to kind of build up a language-able computer system, and maybe potentially one that was even kind of self-aware using those same type of processes?
So just for our audience, in case they haven't listened to some of our earlier episodes where we've talked about this kind of thing, I wonder, could you just unpack that term you used there, relational responding? What's that?
A lot of our words talk about things which are out there in the world. So if we talk about an object like a ball, for instance, we can locate a ball in the environment and we can call this round spherical object a ball, and it might have a color and it might have a particular size or weight. So we can give individual stimuli labels. So different stimuli around us have different labels, but we can also label relationships between stimuli. So that there might be two balls, a big ball and a smaller ball, and we can say which one is bigger, for instance. And that's relational responding. So it's responding to the relationship between two things or between two or more things rather than simply the stimulus qualities directly.
That's helpful, yeah. So I think when I've tried to explain this to people, which I try not to do if I'm honest, very often, like if I were to ask you, is a whale big? I think most people would say it is, because they are thinking about it in relation to perhaps themselves or other animals.
Mm.
But if we place the whale next to the moon, then the whale suddenly isn't big anymore. So
Mm.
it's that's what you're talking about there, right? That you can only responding to one thing in relation to another.
Yes, that's right. So big only makes sense when we're talking about two or more things, and it's the relationship that we're talking about, as opposed to maybe the stimulus qualities of a whale or of the moon. It's about the relationship between those two things.
Okay, great. Thanks for clearing that up. I've had a little go at defining some of the key terms that we might end up using, just so people are clear as to what we're talking about. I'd like you to respond, though, because this is very much a kind of amateur, someone who's interested for a variety of reasons, an amateur's stab at this. So first term I wanted to just make sure we're clear about is the term itself, so artificial intelligence. Now, my understanding of this is it's like an area of computer science that's about creating systems and machines that are capable of performing the kind of task that ordinarily a human would perform. So there's my amateur stab at that. Does that kind of capture it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it does, in that it relates it to things that humans would do. I mean, I've got a broader definition of it that I tend to use, which is any machine system that makes decisions. So at the most basic level, a fridge is an artificial intelligent system. Basically, when the temperature gets too warm inside, then it turns on the compressor at the back and cools itself down. So it's controlled by a thermostat. So it's a sort of an automated decision-making process at its most basic level. And then we move on up to more complex types of decision-making processes and big statistical models, which are part of large language models, which you're probably going to get onto next.
Nice. Yeah, that's really helpful. And when people are talking about AI a lot these days, there is this term AGI, so artificial general intelligence, which seems to be the kind of explicit aim of lots of big tech AI companies, that they're trying to get to a point where, rather than this kind of narrow AI. So, like, you have a machine that's really good at chess, for example, or a machine that's really good at sorting out your email inbox. We have a machine that kind of matches human level cognitive ability across all fields. So almost like it's as good as a human at everything.
Yeah, that's broadly how I would see it too. So you have a narrow AI which can do, as you say, one task, and a general AI which can do lots of different tasks. At the moment, actually, all AIs are narrow AIs. We don't actually have a general AI system at the moment. People have tried building them. They've taken lots of individual AIs and then bolted them all together and said, look, we've got an AGI system, but it's not. It's basically a whole load of AI, individual AI, narrow AIs, all collected together under one roof. So at the moment, even though there's lots of excitement and hype about AGI, we still haven't got it. We still only have a narrow AI at the moment.
And there's a bunch of competing claims about exactly how long that might take. And some people I've heard say we're as close to it as next year. Other people are more like it's 5 or 10 years away. But I think seem to be talking in fairly short term, as opposed to, I don't hear many people saying, oh, that's hundreds of years away.
Maybe not hundreds of years away, but I suspect it's further than many people think. It's really hard to work out how much of this conversation, though, out there in the business world is hype for share prices, or how much of it is actually real. So Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, I think last year was talking about how the most recent ChatGPT would be, the next step towards AGI. And AGI was getting ever closer. We just need to make these systems bigger and bigger and bigger, and they will miraculously, sort of a general intelligence will pop out of them. Whereas you have other people like Jan LeCun, who used to be the head of research for Meta, and I think he's now working independently or for some other venture capitalist probably somewhere, who says, no, we're never going to get there simply by scaling these existing AI models. And I tend to agree with Jan LeCun here. I don't think it's just a scaling issue. There are much more fundamental questions about how intelligence and general intelligence operates and functions that we're a long way off. Most people in the field don't know anything about that. We haven't even got a kind of an agreed definition of intelligence. So it feels to me that we're a long way off. That said, once they get a sniff of the right track, there's a huge amount of money and some very clever people, and they'll chase it down very quickly.
2 more. So one is ASI, so artificial superintelligence. Now, this seems to me to kind of represent quite a hypothetical point in the future whereby AI surpasses human intelligence in every aspect. So you've got a machine that has kind of above PhD level knowledge in everything.
That's my understanding of ASI as well. I think it's born out of a lot of anxiety, actually. It's the sort of the omniscient computer that can control and make decisions all independently. A bit like HAL, the computer that goes a bit crazy in 2001, or Skynet and all those Terminator films. This is sort of big super brain that will understand everything there is to know about the planet or about humans and can make decisions much more quickly than we can. That does feel a long way off to me, and I think that's more born out of anxiety and out of people's kind of imaginations, creative imaginations, to in books and literature and movies, rather than something which we're anywhere near at the moment. But that said, once we kind of crack basic intelligence, imagine if you have a basic general intelligence, and then you can bolt onto it instant access to the internet, then you basically have all that knowledge which is out there instantly at the fingertips of a system. That could be quite an impressive system.
Yeah, and I guess you could then imagine a scenario where you create, I don't know, 1 million instances of this thing, and so you've got an island of absolute geniuses all working together on the next iteration, the next stage of development. You can imagine it reaching a kind of exponential point where the development of AI just goes, like 1 million miles an hour all of a sudden.
That's right. And human beings are always really good at using tools to make new tools, to make new tools, to make new tools. And you're absolutely right. If we had an AGI, we would use that AGI to make even better AGI. that's exactly what it would be used for.
So last definition then is a large language model. So this is a term that's used to describe all of the things that probably listeners would be familiar with. So ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Grok, all of those kinds of AI models. So my amateur stab at this is a type of artificial intelligence that's trained to understand, generate and manipulate the language that's used by humans.
Yes, you used the word understanding there, which is interesting. We'll come back to that. I mean, yes, a large language model is really a big statistical mathematical model based on a neural net, which is able to kind of encode and decode sequential data sets. And that gives it the kind of the apparent understanding of human-like text. I'm not sure I don't think it does understand it. I mean, the way they work is they take text, say in a magazine or a book or just written down somewhere, and then they feed it into the large language model, the neural net, and then they say predict the next word. So once they've broken down the sentence down into sort of chunks, or then it says predict the next word, and then if it predicts the next word, then it gets rewarded. It gets a biscuit for it, basically, and then it's more likely to predict that word. So they're really basically huge predictive text systems, but trained on vast amounts of data. So they get very good at predicting what the next word in a sentence or the next chunk of language in a sentence should be. And then when you put that together, they can be really impressive. And what I think is amazing, I don't think people realize, is that this is a technology called transformer technology, which they developed, I think, in something like 2018, so quite recently. And they started making them bigger and bigger and bigger. And when they did so, they got all this amazing language functionality out of it, which they hadn't been predicted. They didn't quite know what would happen when they made it bigger. But they started making these neural network statistical models bigger. And they started producing really fluent sentences that made sense in relation to the training history which the net had been trained on. And people really got amazed by this. But that was only 2018. And then it was only 2022 when the first ChatGPT came out. So these technologies are really, really new. And what I think is kind of very lovely is that the people that developed it were surprised by this incredible language fluency that this basic system produced. And then people got very carried away with it and started thinking that the system could actually understand language, whereas actually what it's really good at is predicting what the next word is likely to be based on its whole training history, which it's got.
Anything you want to come in on, Ray?
Mainly the observation that when you see these things generate language, it is hugely impressive and very kind of like human-like, right until the moment it isn't. And the AI, the LLM, the large language model, sort of suddenly creates a kind of error that you can't conceive of any verbally able human doing. And the image equivalent, I guess, is when people ask them to generate images of things, and suddenly there's stray limbs or the wrong number of fingers. So I think one of the things that's striking is how amazingly impressive they are. But then just the category of mistake is a different level of mistake than we'd expect from a human making a bit of a slip up on something.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think they don't produce language in the way human beings produce language. They basically produce a pastiche of human language, which is very impressive, and it can be very helpful actually. If you ask a question in relation to a particular context, it can be quite helpful, and people are using it all the time, and increasingly so. Actually, scarily so when you look at some of the software companies now who are using some of these AIs, because they're not just good at predicting spoken language, they're also alphabetic language, also good at predicting programming language, what should come next. So lots of companies are now using AI to produce software, which then gets put into various systems. And it can be very helpful in many ways and do a lot of amazing things. I think that the trap or the illusion that we fall into is that it's somehow understanding, producing language, whereas I'm not sure it is. I think it's producing things that we find useful in the language or in symbolic space.
And we're very keen on anthropomorphizing things, aren't we? Ascribing human characteristics to trees or animals or machines.
Yeah, and that comes out of our language again, doesn't it? That comes out of our relational responding. So we talked about a relational response between a large and a small ball. You can also have a relational response between I and you. Those are two stimuli. Those are two sounds, different sounds. And if I talk about I, then you automatically show up in that relation. If I talk about up, you automatically think of down. If I say hot, you automatically think of cold. If I talk about black, you automatically think of white. If I talk about you talk about I. So when people are experiencing themselves in relation to something, they experience their self as I, then implicit is there's a you there. And the focus of that you, if it's a tree, then we tend to kind of relate to it as an I-you relationship, as if it's a sort of an entity with an identity in the same way that we have. And again, that emerges out of our kind of relational response, but the relational response isn't between two things external to us, it's between us and another thing.
Yeah, I always think that's an amazing capacity of human language, that if you use the word you in reference to me, I know that you mean me, even
Mm.
though whenever I use the word you, I'm referring to someone else.
Mm.
It's just a sort of bit of magic, isn't it? That I don't know that you're ever explicitly taught, but you can just kind of do it.
Well, I tried to teach this before I really understood RFT. I tried to teach pronouns to a child. I got myself in a complete muddle. And I didn't know why at the time. But looking back on it, it's because there isn't an external referent for you. It's relative to the speaker. So you have to, in your training, provide lots of examples of the I-you relation as opposed to an external referent that you can, even with the balls, you can talk about the big and the small ball. But with an I-you, then there's no external referent. You can only be learned through multiple examples of perspective taking.
So before we get into a bit more detail on your work on AI and things that are related to ACT, this is a bit of a fun question, really. So there are a few definitions about people's response to AI. So they're accelerationists. They're the people who are pushing for kind of rapid, unrestricted AI development in order to achieve AGI and this utopian sort of techno future. There are the doomers, who are like the opposite of that, people who are just filled with fear and catastrophic interpretations of what this will do to us as a society. And this often quoted, there's a 20% chance that AI will just end up in human extinction. So the doomers want to just stop the race, or at the very least, find a way to put tons and tons of guardrails in to make AI much more safer than it seemingly is at the moment. And then there's a middle ground, the scouts, who occupy this position, sort of believing that the risks are real and therefore we need to be careful, but we don't want to stop the development. So we're going to come to Ray. Accelerationist, doomer, or scout?
I mean, it just may be my absolutely habitual fence-sitting posture, but scout seems closer. Scout with a side order of cynic, of exactly how much is going to be possible anyway, but scoutish.
Okay, thank you. Freddy?
Yes, I'd describe myself as a scout. There are definite risks, and there are definite upsides. We absolutely need to be putting in place governance and regulation around this technology. And I think we need to be doing that hand in hand with developing it.
Okay, right. This is great because one of the themes of our podcast is that Ray and I seem to find it quite hard to find things to disagree about. Here's one. So, I'm a card-carrying doomer. It worries me no end. I've seen Terminator. I've seen how this story ends. And yeah, I'm really quite concerned. And I sort of don't understand why more people aren't more worried about AI. Because I absolutely take what you say there, Freddie, upsides and downsides. But it seems to me that it's not an equal playing field. Like I could have a nuclear reactor in my garden powering my house, and it makes everything better. But there's a 1% chance that all of us die from radiation as a consequence. I'm not having that nuclear reactor in my garden. 20% chance that it ends the world. If we had a bridge and there was a 20% chance it would collapse if you crossed it, I don't think anyone's crossing that.
They definitely aren't. I guess the 20% is made up as a number, isn't it? That's the difficulty. I mean, there are risks, absolutely, Rich. I think that it's not like there aren't risks. Knowing the technology as I do, the large language technology, it's got cultural and political risks and economic risks. I don't think it's this technology. It's not an AGI. It's definitely not an ASI. It's basically very good at predicting the next, word or part in a sentence. So from that point of view, I don't think it's the risk that people think it is, but it may well be the journey we're on is going to take us there. Maybe further down the line, Rich, I may be joining you in that doomer camp. This is a regulation issue for me. Human beings are always developing technologies which are quite dangerous, going back to something like the knife, the gun, and we have to make sure that we regulate these things so that they're not the risk which they could be in everyday society.
Okay, Freddie, we've talked about some of the broader issues about the territory we're in, and some of how you came to be involved both in psychological approaches like ACT and also AI. Could you tell us a little now about the specific work you've done that kind of brings those two things into contact? Because I heard you speak about this a few months ago, and I was just absolutely fascinated. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted you to be able to share some of that stuff.
Yes, well, since I sort of started on this journey, it's really been about building relationships with people that have really got skills in this area and then trying to introduce them to ACT and relational frame theory ideas and seeing if they'd partner with me. So really it's been a journey of trying to meet people and see if they'd be up for doing any joint projects. And over the years, I've met some great people actually. And now I've got 3 main projects which I'm working on. But before we talk about those projects, it's probably worth just talking about the process of meeting people and trying to get people to understand a little bit about ACT and RFT and why it might be interesting to model these things in a computer or in a neural network. Because I reached out to people in computer science departments. When I first started trying to do this, I need to speak to some people that really understand neural nets so we can talk about whether we can model it. The difficulty is these people are all really, really busy. So you contact them and you come up with some, what I think are quite attractive, interesting ideas. And they say, yeah, it sounds great. And I'm too busy doing this other stuff. So finding people who are at the right stage of their career, who are up for having the conversation and taking it forward, turned out to be really, really difficult. I don't know how many emails or how many kind of efforts I made at the beginning trying to find people I could have a conversation with about, modeling and trying to develop ACT in an AI system. That's it. Once you get started, once you get a few relationships, or once you've met someone, then that often leads on to something else and leads on to something else. And then from there, I've been able to develop quite a few kind of relationships with people over the years. So the 3 areas that I've been working on, the first one is the one I probably started on at the beginning, was trying to model the most basic types of relational responding in an AI system. And we tried to do this actually initially in a robot system, partly because the person who was first up having a conversation with me was the co-director of the Bristol Robotics Lab, a guy called Manuel Giuliani, really lovely chap. And he just turned up there and he's looking for new ideas. And I approached him and he says, yeah, this sounds great. Let's try and do this in a robot. And now, the challenge of working with robots made the whole thing way, way harder. So it's hard enough anyway, modeling a relational response in a neural network. And then putting that into a robot made it much, much more difficult. And then to try and get any funding, we approached the EPSRC to get some funding. Well, they want to see end product. What's this technology going to be used for? So we had to come and construct all these potential therapeutic possibilities for this robot that we hadn't even built the most basic part of. Now, needless to say, it was actually far too ambitious and too kind of complex. But I kind of learned from that and realized we need to be much, much more modest. And luckily, I then met someone else called Nathan Duran, who's a really smart computer scientist here in Bristol. And I've been working with him and trying to model the most basic relational response that there is, which is if you learn that A equals B, you also know that B equals A. So basically reversing a learned relationship. Human beings can do that just like that. Interestingly, only human beings can do that. You can't get a chimpanzee, not even a language-able chimpanzee can reverse a learned relationship. In fact, no other animal can, but human beings can do it really, really simply. So the question is, could we do that in a neural network? And it sounds really, really simple, but it took us 2 years of lots of different architectures. I mean, Nathan's a bright lad and he went through a number of different architectures. Some of them he knew probably weren't going to work, but he was so thorough. He said, I just want to do it, get the data, and we can definitely say this didn't work. So eventually we found an architecture which could model these basic relations. And then we wrote a paper on it, and we've got that out trying to publication. But what's interesting, it's very underwhelming for the computer science world, because they say, what? You've basically shown that you can create a system that can reverse a learned relationship, when any 8-year-old can program a computer to reverse a learned relationship between A and B. So they are very underwhelmed by it. I think it's a fantastic piece of work, because it is literally the first time we've ever had, as far as we know, a generalized relational response modeled in an AI system. It hasn't caught people's imagination quite as I hoped it would. So the second piece of research I developed, or I've been lucky to be part of, was with a PhD student, but working with Oliver Ray, who's a lecturer at Bristol. And one of his PhD students was kind of keen to try and model some of these basic processes. But what he was really interested in doing was modeling them visually. We got networks of relations, and then we trained networks of relations, and then he was up for modeling them so we could see how these networks actually emerged as kind of visual patterns. And that was really great fun. And he's really interesting. He does all sorts of AI art work. And at the moment, I think he's up in London working on an art gallery up there, helping them kind of catalogue and make sense of a lot of their art up there. So he's really interested in using these technologies kind of creatively. So that was the second project where we looked to try and model larger relational networks, visualize them so we could see them in real time. I must say, I found that really exciting to kind of take some real data that had been used with humans and then put it into a machine and then see how these simple networks emerged and changed over time as you kind of trained them. So that was the second piece of research that I've been involved with. And then the third piece of research came from a different direction, actually. That didn't come out of my efforts to meet people in the academic world. It came more out of a friend of mine, basically, who had some issues with one of his children's development. And he wondered about, what kind of support there was out there. And when he tried to get some support, he realized there was nothing. There was nothing really, unless you have really significant difficulties, you won't get support out of the NHS if you've got children with child development questions. So he spoke to me about it, and I said, well, I'd be using these ACT type models. And he really got interested in using the ACT models and making sense of them. And so he read all the key papers in the area. And he's also an engineer by background. So he thought, well, what if I can build something which can actually take all this knowledge that we have in the psychology world, which is useful for people, and put it into a system which can be helpful for people in similar situations to the situation I found myself in. And he's developed an AI tool called Sylva, Sylva, and it's a online tool for helping families with children who have got neurodiversity to function more in their day-to-day living. So it provides guidance and coaching for the families about how they might help their kids with getting to school, or with emotional issues, or with peer relationships, or with what they're going to eat. So all those kind of everyday questions that come up for many kids, and sometimes be a bit harder for kids with neurodiversity profiles. So what he's done is develop this technology, which is available now, and people can come download and get some advice and guidance on their parenting for these kids. And it's a fantastic tool, actually. We just published a validation study on it, where we took 400 questions which parents had asked on chat rooms and on the internet. And we then put them into the AI system, and then we validated, or we evaluated the answers which the AI system came out with. And it was really impressive. I mean, it scored very, very similar to what we thought a human should be answering. And then at one point, we put 50 questions into the AI, and then we answered 50 questions ourselves. And then we got the two answers evaluated independently by another psychologist to see, if they were that different. And they weren't that different. And whereas it took me, 15 minutes to write a 150-word answer, this AI kind of knocked it out in less than 5 seconds. And it wasn't that different from what I was saying. And in a way, we shouldn't be surprised, because the training material, which this AI is specifically trained on, is the same training material that shaped me as a practitioner. So you can take these large language models, which are very good at producing fluent language, then you can train them in a particular area, and they become able to use, if you like, that knowledge or that language as is written down in one area, and put it into a nice fluent, accessible format for humans. I think one of the big things about this is it will be very accessible for people in a way that I'm not. If you want to see me, you have to book an appointment, and then you have to you come and visit me, and then it has to cost you
Mm.
money. Whereas these AI tools, you can use them, 11 o'clock at night on a Friday evening if you want to, for as long as you want to have a conversation with it. And the responses you're going to get from it are kind of similar to what an experienced psychologist might be able to give. It's very, very careful not to, about safety. It's very careful about not giving advice to people who are in particularly vulnerable situations. It's much more kind of everyday parenting, coaching processes. So there's a lot of guardrails on it to make sure it's a safe technology. But in terms of kind of opening up and making accessible for people advice and guidance from a reliable source, I think it's a great technology.
I mean, those all sound really, really exciting. And that third one particularly, I guess, is very close to that principle of usefulness of the kind of, I can see what that's for. That's not just about a more broad understanding of processes. That sounds like it's, very much targeted at something that's going to be useful to people.
Very much so. And I think one thing to bear in mind is in Bristol at the moment, we have something like 4,000 families waiting for their child to be assessed for autism, and it's a waiting list is something like 5 years or something absolutely bonkers,
Wow.
which is effectively, no service. So all these families at the moment are waiting for really long periods of time and getting no support. And at the end, even when you do have one of these assessments, it doesn't provide you with ongoing support about what to do about your child's particular needs and developmental issues. So we have a massive need out there at the moment, and we have a technology tool which I think can provide support kind of quickly and at scale in a way we're not going to solve this problem with humans. I mean, even if they produce the funds to assess all these families, in say 6 months, where would you find all the trained practitioners who could do it? And then once you've done all of that, who's going to provide the ongoing support to these families? It's not something which is solvable, I think, with lots of money. I think that, even if we put lots of money into it, we're not going to solve it because the practical issues are so great. This is a place where I think some of these AI technologies can be really helpful. I think they really can step in and fill a gap that currently we're not going to fill. Now, these families otherwise are going to sit there and get nothing for years.
Wow.
That's a very persuasive argument. That we've had a question from a listener that feels kind of related to that. So this comes from Ravi Amruth, and his question is that given that some tech companies appear to be attempting to sort of bottle and mass produce traditional CBT techniques to be delivered by AI, so like an AI therapist, I wonder what you think the relationship is between AI and ACT, and whether we might be able to be producing ACT therapists using AI in the near, medium, distant future.
So you mean whether we can produce an AI system that delivers ACT therapy? I think we can. I think that it won't be exactly the same as human, but I think a lot of it can be similar. If we look at the core processes within ACT I think is got advantages over many other approaches in that it's quite specific about the key mediational processes which it's trying to teach and trying to support in people's repertoires. And I think we could teach these technologies or develop these technologies so they can help people learn these and use these mediational processes. About, I don't know, a month ago, we interviewed some people and we asked them some questions about therapeutic processes. And these are, experienced, qualified psychologists, and they didn't really know the answers to these mediational questions. They operated very much at the level of technique, but what about the actual mediational processes, the active ingredient inside these techniques? People didn't really know. Yet we can teach and we can train an AI system to be able to deliver those processes quite consistently. So I suspect that we are going to get these AI therapists, which will work well. There's some problems, though, that an awful lot of communication is nonverbal. We're relying very much on this language word process. This whole podcast works because of it. And AI systems are very good at predicting the next word in a sequence. But as you know, an awful lot of communication isn't verbal. So that's one major gap that these technologies are a long way from even thinking about, let alone addressing. And the other one I think that was pointed out to me by someone was that we don't quite know how good people are at keeping commitments to AI systems. We tend to sort of switch them off and bend the rules. So we know, for instance, from the literature that if you want to stick to a goal or a task, if you make it public, you increase your likelihood of doing that. So if I say, right, I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week, if I tell people that's what I'm going to do, I'm much more likely to actually go ahead and do it than if I just kind of make a deal with myself in my head. So there's something about the publicness and relationship which is really important that I'm not sure you get with these AI systems. Now, I think it's easy to kind of make a commitment to an AI and then break it. I mean, I remember as a kid, when I started playing with chess with an AI, whenever it used to beat me, there's a function on it where you could swap from black to white. So I would just swap back to the opposite side, so I would beat it every time. So there was I had no kind of commitment or loyalty to this AI system. I just kind of used it, and then when it suited me, I kind of swapped around. I think there are these sorts of things in the human process and the human relationship which you're not going to get with an AI. But I think in terms of delivering the core processes of change, I think they can do that really well and quickly and at scale.
I can easily see how some of that works in terms of sort of therapist to client. Okay, I'm going to teach this. I'm going to deliver the work on this. How does that work the other way around? So one of the core sort of therapy skills is the sort of the sense making and hearing sort of free text accounts of what went on at that family party and beginning to sort of like pattern match that to whatever given psychological model you're working within, to be able to say, oh, I think I'm seeing experiential avoidance. I think I'm seeing this. I'll ask a couple of questions, test that, and then we'll move on that. I mean, does that feel like a kind of thing that AIs are well suited to?
While they wouldn't do it in that way, you're quite right. When we're working with people, we're often having an internal, what's going on here? What am I picking up? What am I noticing here? And I don't think that's what's going on with an AI at all, with a large language model AI. I think it's responding to the content of the language, the words which it's seeing, and then in the context of an ACT model, it's predicting what would be the next best word to put into that sequence of words. And what's amazing is that it does that really well, and it's actually very helpful. But there's no kind of secondary thought process alongside that trying to figure out a formulation for someone. It's literally a predictive text system. But because the training data set is so huge, it can still be really, really helpful. And as you know, if you've probably used AIs, a lot of it is about giving it the cues and the prompts to really focus it in to make it as helpful as possible. That said though, Ray, I don't know if you had to play with them, but they can be very, very helpful. And I think that they won't necessarily work for everyone, and they won't necessarily work for some more complicated situations and places where we need much more non-verbal information. And for people who want a little bit of guidance or coaching, or what should I do in this situation? I'm struggling to get my child to school. Have you got some ideas? Which actually makes up a large amount of people's lives. Giving people some advice, and at the moment, of course, a lot of that stuff is out there, but it's in books on shelves. So I kind of think that what we're doing is we're taking a lot of the information in those books and then putting it into a more accessible format that otherwise people aren't necessarily going to sit down and read the book and find the right bit in the book. I mean, there's also lots of evidence that certain sections of our population don't use therapeutic services anyway. So, for instance, the travel community typically don't use therapeutic services at all, but they will pick up an AI and they will have a play with that. Similarly, some of our cultural groups, they're not particularly keen on going to sit down in a waiting room, at an outpatient somewhere, but they will pick up an AI. It enables us to get some of these ideas and supports to people who otherwise aren't going to pick up a book and aren't going to come and sit in a clinic to have a conversation with one of them.
I'm going to channel my inner doomer, and I'm not doing this to get at you, but it's just interesting to have someone who's so well informed to speak to about it. I've heard that the number one use case of ChatGPT already is exactly what you're talking about. It's personal support. I guess loosely we could describe it as therapy, but it's people go into it for advice about problems that they're coming up against in their everyday life. And it's very interesting whenever I'm on any kind of professional forum, like a clinical psychology Facebook group, and this topic comes up, people have, express a bit of existential anxiety, like, will I still have a job in 10 years? There's always someone who very confidently says, absolutely not. the essence of therapy is a human connection, and there's no way that an AI will ever take our job, which I just feel is incredibly naive. Like it reminds me of Wilbur Wright very famously said, people won't fly, humans won't fly for 1,000 years. And he said that 2 years before him and his brother figured out how to fly. We're just not very good at seeing the future. And I think a lot of people, when they make these proclamations about, oh, well, AI will never do this, they are basing it on AI today without factoring in the rapid development of AI. I mean, as you said, it's 2018, we hadn't even heard of this, right?
I think that's such a good point. And the powered flight analogy is very powerful because the Wright brothers created powered flight in 1903. In 1969, 66 years later, we put people on the moon. So think about that. We'd only literally invented powered flight in 1903, and yet within someone's lifetime, people could end up on the moon. And that's the power of kind of human science and technology in many ways. Now, there are downsides to this as well. The issue about the therapeutic relationship is interesting because Steve Hayes has got a great kind of line about this, about what the therapeutic relationship is. I'll see if I can find it, but it's something along the lines of if you're fully present consciously with another person, listening to what they say, and you're doing what you can to help them move towards what matters to them in their life, that is the therapeutic relationship. And that essentially is what psychological flexibility is trying to do as well. It's trying to be there as a therapist to support someone's psychological flexibility. And he makes the point that psychological flexibility can be taught. And I think we can have systems which are fully present, which listen carefully and which or respond carefully, I should say, and help people move towards things that matter to them. And people will experience that as a therapeutic relationship. And in fact, when we look at the research, people definitely do. They feel these systems are very empathic and they feel that they're understood by these systems because the responses which these systems produce back are very much like an empathic human being, what an empathic human being would say. So this technology is already doing these things, actually, and it does them pretty well, I think. There are limitations and gaps that were kind of mentioned earlier, and some of those we're not going to solve anytime soon, but I think we can still use this technology beneficially in the short term, just as it is, just by kind of pointing it in the right direction so it's got the right literature, putting the right guardrails and guidance on it, getting information out into families who need it. I was talking to one mum and she was talking about how, when she went into the loo, she sat down and she opened up the Silver app and had a quick look about what she should do. So when she came out, she could try something different. And she said she found that really empowering. And that type of accessibility and flexibility is extraordinary. Otherwise, she's not going to go in there with a book. She's going to go in there and make a phone call to someone. Well, that's kind of hard too. But as it was, she got what she needed straight away. I mean, my anxieties around these technologies, though, are probably more to do with the regulations around them and how they're mostly controlled by corporations whose primary objective seems to be making money rather than trying to produce a technology which actually does some good and helps people. Silver is a not-for-profit B Corp organization. There's someone who's got lived experience, who's trying to use his skills to try to create something which other families might find useful. Most other technologies don't have those kind of CEOs. They're often run by rapacious individuals with even hungrier shareholders.
Well, there's that lovely quote from Charlie Munger, who's Warren Buffett's business partner, which goes something along the lines of "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." And an example being social media, that if the incentive of social media companies is to capture your attention, like rather than have this wonderful global town hall where everyone gets a democratic voice, we've just ended up with this kind of what someone once described as a race to the bottom of the brainstem, attention grabbing, shorter and shorter and shorter videos that are, rage bait. And so, I worry about that too. I worry that the people who are incentivized to make the progress don't have good incentives at the heart.
Sorry, I was going to say, that Tony Bigman makes that point, doesn't he? He says that essentially corporations are amazing collections of really creative, talented people. And if we set the parameters and the incentives, as Charlie Munger might say, and the regulation right, they can do amazing things. And if we just leave them to their own devices to make money, they can do that as well. So it's incumbent on us, really, to put pressure on our politicians and be part of the political process to create the incentives and the framework in which these companies can operate. Otherwise, it is a race to the bottom of the brainstem, as you mentioned.
Just to circle back to Ravi's point, many people would think the best scenario here is enormous social change and, mass simultaneous job loss across many, many sectors, because we've not really invented a tool. We've invented an inventor. We've invented something that is incredibly skilled at, or can be trained to be incredibly skilled at everything.
Yeah.
There are certainly anything knowledge related. So you can, it doesn't feel difficult for me to see a future where the knowledge of a doctor, for example, is much more at threat than the care of a nurse.
I think that's very true. I think that the direct human contact industries are going to be the ones which aren't going to be replaced by these types of AI. I remember hearing many years ago that archaeology was also safe from AI because basically it's very hard to do. You need lots of people digging around in the dirt, and there's no money in it. But there's no incentive for these corporations, so it's safe. A friend of mine works in the database industry, and he's been very cynical about AI, and particularly his company at the beginning of the year said, you have to start using AI. And he said the metric that they were all evaluated by was how much they used the AI. Not what it did, but we just want you to use it. And he thought this is not that impressive. And then come March, there was an update, and the software, he's a software engineer for databases. The software it was producing, he thought was, wow, this is really quite good. So he did a little test and experiment himself. He basically used the AI as they suggest you do, which is you kind of structure it and then you bring the AI in to do certain tasks. He then also wrote a solution himself to a particular challenge, and then he also gave the AI free rein and said, "You solve it, whichever way you want to do it." And he compared the three outcomes. And bearing in mind, this is someone who's very capable, has been in the industry for 20, 25 years. And the result scared him because he said the result where I just said to the AI, go and do it yourself, was better than his or him assisted by an AI could produce. So after that, he's kind of changed. And in 6 months, he's gone from someone saying, there's so much hype around this stuff, I don't really believe it, to, oh my word, this is coming from my job very, very soon. And I don't know where it's going to be. And each time I see him, he kind of jokes, well, I've still got my job. And he wasn't saying that 6 months ago.
Wow.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've looked, but on I know you probably haven't followed it, but the share prices of software companies globally have absolutely tanked in recent years not recent years, in recent months, because people are betting on the AI large language models basically replacing large numbers of programmers in the system. Now, is that going to happen? We don't know. This bubble will almost certainly burst and there'll be a big shakedown from it. And it seems from what he says that these technologies are scarily good. So in the same way that we can see large language models that can produce quite extraordinary, language outputs that can deliver types of therapy, they can also deliver database programs of quite a high quality. It's just interesting, just if I may, one of the things he says is that this software produces large amounts of backup documentation to explain what it's doing and how it's working. And you're meant to read all that. So his job is to basically read all that documentation now on these AI systems and check that it's doing what it said it's doing. But he says they're so long that he doesn't read them. And he says he doesn't know anyone that reads them. So what we're having is this AI is producing software tools or programs that aren't actually being checked by humans because there's just so much to read. And these AIs are chucking out loads of these programs. You have to read thousands of words every day. It needs to be reading to check on this. And of course, he isn't. So we've sort of let loose this, I don't know, whatever it is, this software process that as and when it goes wrong, no one's going to understand where it's gone wrong or how it's gone wrong. And it feels to me a little bit like the subprime mortgage scenario whereby we bundle this debt together and then we didn't know where it was. And I suspect that we've got all this software out there, some of it will good, some of it's bad, and we don't understand how any of it works. And then we're going to have to reset. Who knows? Predicting the future is very difficult, I think, as Niels Bohr once said.
So in addition to sort of the big doomer concerns about the end of humanity and the end of the world, and also some of the things we've just been talking about, sort of threats to the economy, threats to the workforce and our employment, I guess a couple of the other things that get talked about a little in potential downsides of AI is the impact it can have in areas like art and in education as well, as well as the things we can see for the good, the things we can see that perhaps aren't so much for the good. I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, interestingly, I'm probably more doomer in this space than I am kind of scout, actually. There's an awful lot of AI slop which is produced out there, which I think is pretty detrimental, actually, to people's lives, just uses up a huge amount of energy. We haven't talked about the environmental impact, actually, at all, which is another big downside. I think I mentioned to you that I heard Tim Minchin talking at the Hay Festival, and he was talking about how art is content plus intent. So it's something which you can kind of experience, but there's an intention behind it, which is really what brings art to the fore. And he talked about Tracy Emin's bed. You don't just look at that as an unmade bed. You look at it as an intention that she was having, and you look at that in the context of what the art world means. And he doesn't think that the AI can produce intent. It can produce content, but it can't produce intent. I like that kind of that definition, that it can produce a whole lot of stuff that you can look at, but it doesn't really have an intention or any kind of meaning beyond what we might kind of give it in the here and now. And that said, there's a lot of threat there.
Can I ask you both a question then in respect of that? So, Ray, you and I at the top of the program were talking about jazz. Let's imagine that there is the best piece of jazz ever, and it's just note perfect. It's just spot on. It's just like the best thing you've ever heard, but it was produced by AI. Would you still be interested in listening to it? That's a question for both of you. You might not like jazz, Freddie, but substitute in your favorite musical genre, stroke work of art, film, movie, book, whatever.
I think I would. If you played me a piece of music, I thought that's great, and then you said actually an AI wrote it, I think my enjoyment of it would drop instantly. And partly, as we were talking about a bit, there's something about any kind of music, arguably jazz particularly, that is about human creativity and what was the process that went through. How did that person make the leap from that note to that note to that note, which is entirely different to thinking, well, there's a computer that copied, that was a bit of this, a bit of that, and a bit of that. You've lost the kind of the spirit and the soul of it, those more intangible elements.
I agree, actually. I think that, because I think of AI as essentially a pastiche system. It produces something which looks like something without actually being the real thing. So I would say, wow, that sounded amazing. And I probably would just move on from it. I think there's something about the way it's produced that I would mean that I wouldn't value it as much as produced by humans.
Unsurprisingly, I'm the same. I don't want to see two teams of AI robots slugging it out on a football pitch. Like, I'd have absolutely no interest in that. One thing that just to strike me about this, though, is we are a bunch of relatively old folk, right? And you work with younger people, Fred. Did you think the answers would be the same if we asked them?
I don't think they would, actually, no. I think there is a level of normality to the AI experience and the technology experience. For me, it's still a bit of a novelty and something which is over there that I can engage with. I think for other people, for youngsters, I think it's just part of life. Yeah, let's get some young people and ask them. My gut feeling is I think there's a different experience for them.
We don't have young people on this. This isn't for them.
The clue's in the title.
There's an interesting counterpoint question, though, I think, because if you could say, actually, you could employ a decorator to come in and it would just do the best decorating job in your house, but it's an AI robot, I think there's much less resistance. I notice less resistance to that. I think, as of now, I'd still rather employ a human, but at some point, and going back to your point about silver, if someone is going to give me the top-notch medical advice or is going to do my kid's heart surgery or something, I'm not going to worry about whether it's an AI or not.
Well, and an awful lot of human decisions are already involving technology, actually. So you get on an aircraft that's flown nearly entirely by computers, or nuclear industry that's run entirely by computers. So an awful lot of decisions have already been handed over to AI systems. But I think you're right. There are some things which we are more sensitive to, and I think art is clearly one of those. Tim Minchin would say the intention behind it. There's some great technologies out there that I think that are going to be here very soon. Like there's a raspberry picking robot, which is quite extraordinary, and it doesn't pick as quickly as humans, but it kind of picks through the night. And I don't know if you ever picked kind of raspberries and strawberries as in your student days. I did. It was really, really hard work. And actually, if you get a robot that can do that, I don't really mind that actually. But the idea that of a robot producing a piece of art, well, I would just see that as a robot art and move on. It can look pretty, but it wouldn't have the same meaning for me.
All right. So I just wanted to circle back, Freddie, because you mentioned it, and I'm glad you brought it up because I think it's one of those things that people perhaps don't know, or if they know, they sometimes don't care very much. But there is a pretty significant environmental cost to AI in terms of the compute that's required and these enormous data centers that are being built that use the same amount of electricity as the nearby town. There's that as an ethical question. I think the other thing that you said earlier just reminded me that the three of us we've all written books, journal articles, all of that stuff has been, in inverted commas, stolen by AI companies to train their models. I wonder, do you, being someone that works in the field, how do you sleep at night? That's the question I'm asking, Freddie. Does any of this stuff worry you? Are you concerned about the ethical issues around AI?
Yeah, it does. I think I said when I had an AI symposium that I think that every single AI symposium at a CBS conference should have an ethical presentation, an ethical paper on there. I think we have to be discussing ethics hand in hand with discussions about this technology. And I think we can't, it's not an afterthought, it has to be there. I mean, the environmental cost is staggering. And this is just one little kind of plug here for relational frame theory. Now, at the moment, these systems need vast amounts of training data and vast amounts of computing power to hold these big statistical models. But your brain uses about 30 to 40 watts of power for doing a whole lot of relational responding processes. If we can get these generalized relational responding processes in a machine, we can potentially massively cut the energy usage needed by current AI models to get the similar sort of output. It doesn't address the other questions we talked about, ethics of who owns it and how the corporations are functioning. But potentially there's another route to producing language systems which is much more energy efficient. And until we get there, there's a big ethical question for we're stressing our planet even more by using these technologies, often for not particularly meaningful ways or helpful ways it's being used at the moment.
There are, of course, I hesitate to even start talking about this, but there are some fledgling, I don't even know what you'd call them, biotech systems. There are vats, aren't there, where there are computer chips smeared in brain cells that are starting to learn how to play Pong, giving off a funny smell somewhere in the world.
Even then, though, it's not so much that what they're learning, it's that they can produce, you don't necessarily need silicon to have a decision-making process. What you need, though, is the system to be able to learn relational patterns, not simply stimulus physical patterns. So it's just the structure of stimuli, but the relationship between stimuli, which is the key bit. And that's the bit which, amazingly, the whole AI industry hasn't caught on to yet.
A hopeful note.
What are you going to take away, Ray, from this? I mean, I could talk about this for hours, but I think we want to stretch our listeners' patience. But what would you take away from this conversation?
I think one of the key things is just the possible ethical uses, and exactly what Freddie was talking about. The targeted use in populations that are otherwise going to be underserved. And that, maybe sometimes we can't be so precious about wanting things to be exactly this way, this human, this whatever, when actually a huge amount of the actual benefit can be produced in a far more accessible way. Not just accessible in terms of, have we got the staff for it, but, accessible to the person in the middle of the night who's having a crisis, who needs to think about what advice they could do in their parenting. So if it helps with that, it makes me feel slightly less cynical towards the whole enterprise.
That's boring, because that was exactly my takeaway too. I found that really quite moving, actually, when you were talking about silver, the way that that's working. Yeah, and so for every psychologist who might lose their job, there are going to be a whole bunch of people who are going to really benefit. And so maybe that's a trade-off that society needs to start looking at. And I know that you've been the provider of most of the information here, Freddie, but is there anything you would kind of take away from the time we've spent talking?
Just to say, I've very much enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I think we need to keep having these sorts of conversations, not just ourselves, but society, about that, the upsides and the downsides, how it's going to be used. It's a technology which isn't going to go away, so we need to figure out how we're going to use it, and that'll happen best, I think, through these sorts of conversations, snippets here or bigger conversations there, but we need to keep having these kind of conversations. And other than that, I think I've very much enjoyed it. It's been nice chatting with you too.
It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Freddie.
Yeah, thanks, Freddie. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you. So we can't let you leave just right away, though, because there's a regular feature of the show that we like to keep in. So this is where I ask Ray, and now you, a random question. You ready?
I think so.
Let's go and ask Ray, shall we?
What random skill do you have that you're unreasonably proud of?
I am really good at stopping a timer on 00. If you like a stopwatch or stuff like that, I can get so close to, hundredths of a second so quickly. So that's the thing. As you can tell, I am unreasonably proud of.
Can you do that at the petrol pump as well?
Oh, yeah.
I just want a tenner.
If there's a way of monetizing that skill, I'd be quids in.
Lovely. Freddie?
Well, I'm weirdly and somewhat sadly proud of the fact that I can plaster. Was taught to plaster once, and I plastered my whole house. And it's actually not as hard as people say, but people are often quite impressed by the fact, oh yeah, I can plaster. And
Wow.
I am weirdly proud of that fact. It's messy, but you can usually get a flat, smooth wall with a little bit of effort. So that's my thing I'm secretly proud of.
That wins, doesn't it? That's much better than the timer thing.
Unless you're going to trump it, Rich. What's yours?
No, I'm not. I'm really good at packing a bag so that the things fit in it well. I would extend that to I'm really good at packing a boot of a car so that the bags fit in.
Having heard that, Rich, can I swap mine for yours? Because I think that's a fantastic skill. I'd love to be able to pack a bag properly.
Any day, Fred. If I could plaster, I'm looking at my house and thinking of the work that could be done on it. If I could do that, I'll swap you.
Let's swap.
Yeah. Of course, one day there will be AI robots that can do all three of those things absolutely perfectly.
I suspect I'm the first to go in this equation.
I don't know, though, because earlier when Freddie was saying that he'd been involved in some research combining AI and robotics, I thought, do you ever worry that you are going to be visited by a large man in shades and leather jacket carrying a large gun who's been sent back from the future to assassinate you?
Strangely, I haven't had that fear. But I think, Ray, if we are going to look at these skills of which one's most at risk, I think AI is going to be all over a timer, more packing the bag or plastering.
Okay, right, we're going to bring things to a close. I hope that you found that interesting. I hope no one's too worried about the fact that their fridge is intelligent. We will be back with another guest next month. Take care all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.